relationships, intimacy. And tonight she's going to be talking to us about relationships, the potential, the challenge, the conflict, the joy, and the holy, and reflections based on her own personal journey. So thank you for being with us again, Goldie. I'm really personally looking forward to you sharing your wisdom with us once again. And thank you also to Serenne Kaplan, a clinical psychologist who will also be joining us tonight. For many of you, Serenne is not a stranger. She's on the forefront of helping and advising so many people in our community. And I did check you out online, Serenne, before this. And I see that you've really had some amazing pearls of wisdom just to share with our community about dealing with this current situation. And I really look forward to hearing your insights on relationships in general. And just to echo what Fergie said, thank you again to all of you for making the time to sign up. I think I said this last time, I'm going to say it again, but I think it really is commendable. I think so many of us are in survival mode. You know, we're really just worrying about getting through each day, getting through the homeschooling, making sure there's food, not killing our husbands, not killing our children, and to make time for, working on this aspect of personal growth, given what we're all going through, is really commendable. So well done to all of you. It's really wonderful to see such an amazing turnout. Before we turn to Goldie, a practical issue. We are due to be load shed. Goldie, this is something we unfortunately have to deal with in South Africa. Luckily, in Toronto, you do not have to deal with this. But for those of you in South Africa, we are due to be load shed at approximately 8 p.m. very soon. So if some of you need to sign back in on your mobiles, Iti, who is managing everything from a technical perspective, will just let you in again. Hopefully, all the speakers are solid. I had my technical assistant husband set me up, so I should have a backup, and I believe that everyone else is connected, but in case you need to dial in, just giving you the heads up. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn to Goldie. Now, Goldie, you spoke very briefly in our last session 2 weeks ago about your son Zalmi, who has Down syndrome, and you spoke, so you didn't speak about Zalmi for long, but the words that you shared about him were really just incredible. You spoke about Hashem giving you what you can handle, and I've read some of your other pieces of content around Zalmi, and you speak about the joy and the belief you had, and to go through something like that as a couple, I would just imagine is tremendous challenge on even the strongest of relationships. Can you talk to us, Goldie, about how we go about dealing with challenges in our relationships? Every relationship has challenges. It's never all rosy. We're all living through a huge challenge in relationships. But you specifically have come out of a really tremendous challenge on any relationship, and we'd love to hear what your insights are on this. So over to you, Goldie.
Okay, so how many hours do I have? So it's clearly a work in progress, and it's not like I've overcome anything yet. We're always going through challenges as long as we're in Golus and we haven't reached yet the era of Mashiach. There will be challenges. But we do have tools, and Hashem doesn't just throw us down in the world and say, all right, go learn how to swim. He gives us the tools. He gives us a lifeboat. And I'll share with you some of the things that have worked with me and that still sort of encompass my entire outlook in life. So one of my greatest gifts in the world is that I was born Jewish, and that I am a chassid of the Rebbe. Why is that such a great gift? And why is that a gift for all of us? Sometimes a gift, have you ever had a gift you received at a wedding and then you just put it away, and then 6 years later, you're like, oh my God, I never opened that gift. And you open it up and might be a nice dish, and you wonder why did I ever open that? Sometimes we just leave gifts to the side. I'm going to share with you a gift that I have opened many times, and I'm consistently opening the gift. I call them my powerful Hasidic and Talmudic tools that help me overcome challenges. And feel free to listen in to the voice that I speak to every single day. I believe the first gift that was given to me, besides being raised in a Chabad home with my parents and grandparents and studied like Fegi by the Rebbe's, table every Shabbos afternoon by Fabrengens, there is a beautiful, beautiful concept that was given to us by the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe. And he teaches this tool. It's Yiddish, but all the women in my community, most of the South African women in my community know this by heart. It's Trach gut wird sein gut. And it is a dictum that I live by because it's something that's actually been put out there in the secular world very much as well. Although we knew it generations ago. There was a book that was written by a woman, and she wrote this book called The Secret. And for a minute, her name eludes me, but her book was massive in US and Canada, and I don't know if it made it to South Africa, but she was a running bestseller. And the concept of her book is this, Trach gut wird sein gut, but she doesn't use the Yiddish. She says, like attracts like. And what you give out to the universe is what you get back. So her whole base of this book was that you create your destiny. And it's really about reframing. So when something seemingly negative happens, you have to turn it around and think, well, if Hashem made this happen to me, and Hashem is kulo tov, so what's the good in it, and how can I search out for the good? So Fegi and I were having a chat this week, and I was sharing with her, and I don't know, Fegi, if I should go into, but the night that Zalmi was born, and I might have mentioned in the last one, was we were going through the SARS epidemic, similar to actually Corona, just on a smaller scale, and it actually only affected Toronto for some reason. And it was just a very dim, dark time in Toronto history, and I went in to give birth. Now, I had been told a few weeks before I was giving birth to my 8th child, you're almost 40, and what we're seeing here in the sonogram, it's very possible that your child's going to have Downs. And I remember thinking, what? Trach gut wird sein gut. I'm just going to create my reality. But on the other side of my brain, another dictum fell in. Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba b'tunya b'Yosef. That Hashem only gives you what you can handle. So in my very limited mind, I walked out, I remember it was like a sunny day, and I remember walking out of the doctor's office and saying, oh, that's not a problem. Hashem only gives you what you can handle. I know Goldie, and I know Goldie more than anyone knows her, and I can't handle a special needs child. So then I just wiped that off my plate, and I remember coming home and saying to my husband, oh, it was a very uneventful meeting today with the doctor, and yeah, he said something about a Downs, but, let's not even go there. And that is how I dealt with it for the rest of the pregnancy. Well, when Zalmi was born, the reality hit us like within 2 minutes when the doctors put the baby down on my lap and said, trisomy 21, which is a medical term, as you know, for Down syndrome. And at that moment, I thought to myself, okay, I didn't think I have the energy, but clearly if Hashem gave me this child, he is giving me the strength. And at that point, my husband and I remember we just looked at each other. My husband came running in, we looked at each other, and we were very definitive. We said, Hashem gives you what we can handle. It's not going to be easy, but we're going to access all the help we can get. And the one thing we made a very, very conscious and firm decision, and we verbalized it, we said, we're not going to let this challenge break up our marriage or break up our family. We are going to make sure that this child becomes part and parcel of who we are as a couple, as a family, and as shluchim. And my husband, very gifted orator, came home the next morning because Ami was born at night. He stayed with me till 7 a.m. because I was pretty much a basket case, trying to internalize my Trach gut wird sein gut, all those things that I had been taught, that Hashem only does what you can handle and Hashem is with you, all of that, because I was trained in that, right? But at the same time, the reality. And he went home And he spent about 6 or 7 hours talking to my children about this holy soul. And that, because the kids only want to know, is it a boy or a girl? Right? At that point, we had 4 boys, 3 girls. So this child was going to make everything mean. What was going to be? Was it going to be a family of 50-50, 50 females, 50 males? It was a huge, huge happening. Well, it ended up being a boy, so it was 5-3. So after my husband told us to the boys and they were cheering, he had to explain to them what it means now to have a sibling who has a special neshama. And again, this is where the Torah inspiration and the Torah values really affected the way we shaped everything with Zalmi. So the fact that we say that Hashem only gives you what you can handle is true, because Hashem gives you the tools the moment you have the challenge. But then, Sarah, we're just referring back to your question, you have to know where to access that belief. And that is why it's crucial. And I felt it more than ever at that point, because even though I was, a Rebbitzin in a Shul, when it comes to real Rebbitzins, I have many, many role models and mentors that I plugged myself into, and I found inspiration, and I listened to talks that the Rebbe gave, and I searched the books on what it means to have challenges. And that is how we were able to get through, the first few months, and then getting into a rhythm. And even though things were hard and things got harder, but what I didn't tell you on the last talk was that 2 years ago, Zalmi passed away. And that was harder than anything else, because we had become very, very in love and attached to our precious little child, who was challenged in so many areas of life, but we had invested in this pure neshama. And we believed so sincerely that his neshama came from a very holy place, and our family was chosen to be the home for this neshama. And then, just like that, on a Motzei Shabbat, he passed away. So there again, we had to get right back into, what does God say about neshamas leaving? So like in every stage of life, and this is really what my message is, in every stage of life, there are going to be challenges. And it could be COVID-19, and it could be the loss of a child, and it could be a child that's not healthy, and it could be so many different things, loss of a business. There are going to be challenges, but Hashem never, ever leaves us alone without giving us a padding. I give the analogy because during the Shiva, there were thousands and thousands of people who came through our door, not only from Toronto, but from all over US and Canada, because Zalmi, in his incredible way, he was able to reach out to all kinds of people, make an impression. And many people came and flew in for an hour or two. And I remember saying that when you are in a situation that you're struggling with, you have to look for your safety net, almost like the analogy when there's like a fire as kids, you've always seen these stories where there's a fire and someone is on the 7th floor and they're trying to jump out, and the firemen say, jump. And the person is scared to jump because it's 7 stories down, but then they put out this huge net, right? And the person jumps. Have you ever seen that? I feel like all through my life, I feel like there's this net. You can call it Torah, you can call it Hashem, you can call it Chassidus, you can call it a mentor, you can call it your friends. But I felt like there was a net under me. And when we lost Zalmi, that net was there and it caught us.
Wow. So I was on mute, but I have to say I'm a little bit lost for words at what you've just shared with us, Goldie. I think your message has really touched a nerve ending certainly for me and all the women on this call. And I think to be able to experience what is probably every woman's worst nightmare, and be able to see the positivity and the light and the meaning is just strength that is unparalleled. And thank you for sharing that story with us. It's really, really unbelievable to have the kind of strength that you're describing. So thank you for sharing your story. I wanted to turn to Serenne. Also on the topic of vulnerability and challenges in relationships, we received a few questions prior to this call from participants of this call, and I thought maybe, Serenne, you could talk to some of these questions given your expertise. So I'm actually going to read them because they are similar questions, but I think the way they worded really just touch on how real some of these issues are for a lot of us. So the first question says, although I know I would reap the benefits of emotional support, I'm feeling afraid to share my worries with my close relatives and friends, and even with my husband. And the second question is a similar question, but I'll read it out. It says, there's something I'm so disturbed about, but I just can't find the right words to express myself to my spouse. I feel nothing good will come out of speaking about it, as it's a subject of contention. I'm feeling so low and upset. How can I deal with this? And I think certainly the second question really resonates with an issue that I think a lot of women feel, that sometimes you just can't communicate what you need to communicate without it blowing up into flames.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Sarah. I just lost you there. Anyway, it seems like I hope you can hear me. You froze in the last few moments. So I just want to at the outset say that I think in listening to Goldie speak, I think we've all just been witness to a real live example of the immense power of vulnerability in the face of challenge. Such a poignant account of her personal story. And I think that absolutely sets the stage for what we want to talk about. So I think I'm going to try to answer the questions together, because I think both of them that have come up seem to have the same underlying theme of just how hard it is to allow ourselves to become vulnerable in our love relationships in particular. So I'm going to try to answer them together. So for me, vulnerability is an essential cornerstone of an evolved and deeply reciprocal relationship. It's kind of like the holy grail of connection and the currency of emotional closeness. It's absolutely our birthright to be in a cherishing relationship. And yet we are never so vulnerable as when we love. So in my work, I often meet couples who would way rather live in pain than take that risk that comes with getting vulnerable. And we can hear that so clearly in the second question, where the writer expresses how low and how upset this impasse leaves her feeling. And that's because disconnection hurts. But couples often build walls and fortresses, keeping one another out. And they can go on like this for years, hiding out and avoiding each other. So we call this the silo effect. And that is a very lonely place to be. When couples turn away from their vulnerability, it absolutely shortchanges them and keeps them in what I call emotional deficit. It is for sure one of the biggest roadblocks to emotional intimacy. So many couples stay in a place of emotional famine rather than do that vulnerability thing. So our vulnerability is the bedrock of what makes us human, but we are socialized to feel ashamed and fearful of our vulnerable selves and to conceal it at all costs. So Brené Brown is somebody who comes to mind. She is a very prominent writer on the subject of vulnerability and a really go-to person in this area. And she explains that vulnerability is the birthplace of everything that we're hungry for in our relationships. So I think that one of the biggest things that she's taught us is that vulnerability is not weakness. In fact, it's our greatest measure of courage. So it's always interesting for me because I think that vulnerability is always the first thing that we look for in others, but the last thing we want to see others see in us. So this is a steep learning curve, and I think especially for the men I work with, this is really a fraught area for men. So one of the greatest risks that any of us will ever take is to be seen as we really are. And humans crave to be known, to be listened to, and to be understood without feeling judged. And we all have what's called a recognition hunger. So it's interesting that research tells us that the 3 most desired words that people value in a relationship are not, as you might probably guess, I love you, but rather, I understand you. And those words are what hit bullseye. We want to know that our partner will love and accept us without our emotional shields up. So I do a lot of intimacy work in my practice, but until couples can get emotionally naked, this can't really happen successfully. Showing our vulnerability always involves some uncertainty, it involves exposure and taking an emotional risk, especially when we're not completely sure of the outcome. We take the risk, hoping that our partner has our back and is in our corner. So our marriages, our relationships should be our safest harbor. And vulnerability really hinges a lot on trust and on safety, both of which are the most precious commodities in a relationship. They are the building blocks for being able to get vulnerable without fearing the reprisals of either being punished or shamed for it by our partner. So when vulnerability happens successfully, we know that we can reveal ourselves and share with our partners in a way that you know they will never use it to hurt you. That is true emotional intimacy. And yet anybody with a heartbeat fears getting hurt, and we tend to bubble wrap our hearts to prevent that. Vulnerability is probably the biggest litmus test of trust. It's the price that we pay for connecting deeply. When we allow someone else to see us in all our imperfection, we rescue exiled parts of ourselves. And it's not that we're breaking down, rather, we are breaking open. So, what do you do if you find yourself in a vulnerability-starved marriage? So, firstly, I think that the golden nugget here is understanding that taking a vulnerability risk is for sure, hands down, the pathway back to each other. So the writer in question knows this when she says that she's aware of the benefits of getting emotional support, but how she's shying away from it. So what does she do? This means that we have to practice having what I call courageous conversations, one small emotional risk at a time. You can choose courage, says Brené Brown, or you can choose comfort, but you cannot have both. So our brains learn by repetition. So the more we welcome and practice vulnerability in our lives, the less afraid of it we'll be. So my answer to both the questions posed is know that the place in your relationship where your greatest fear and your greatest discomfort lies is also the sweet spot where your greatest opportunities for growth lie.
discomfort is always a doorway to transformation. So take a deep breath and start now.
Thank you, Serenne, and sorry everybody that I disappeared. I thought I was glitch-free from a tech perspective, but apparently not. But I made it back, and I'm really grateful that I managed to hear the bulk of what you were saying, Serenne. It was really, really powerful. I really liked what you were saying about breaking open and not breaking down, and really just tools to discover one another. I think I might suggest to my husband to get emotionally naked, see what he suggests. I like that. But Goldie, I wanted to ask you this question. So sometimes, despite our very best attempts at striving for connection, striving for intimacy, striving for joy, this just doesn't work. And we do see so much divorce, even more so, in this day and age. Can you talk up to us a little bit about Judaism's perspective on divorce? Is there room for divorce in Judaism?
Yes, there is divorce, and there's room for divorce. There is actually a rabbinical court that's called the Geras Court. We do take it seriously. But we look at marriage very differently as well as the rest of the world. I'm just going to share with you a story. When I was in Clearwater, Florida, for those of you who've been over to America. So Florida is like maybe the Cape Town for South Africa. And my sister-in-law's on shluchas there. We would go down there for bar mitzvahs very often. Unfortunately, we had to stay in these really cheapy motels because in her neighborhood, there weren't any nice 4-star or 3-star. They were like really not great stuff. But the family goes, we go for the bar mitzvah, we bring our own linen, our own towels. We get there and then can't wait to leave. But we love the bar mitzvah, right? So it's that juggling. Anyway, it was after the bar mitzvah. It was Sunday morning, early in the morning. We were getting ready to leave back to Toronto. It was December, freezing for us in Toronto. And I said to my husband, you know what? Why don't we go sit outside? There's water there. Let's sit outside before we get back to minus 20 degrees. You'll dive in there, I'll dive in there, and then we'll head to the airport. So we got up really early before we thought anyone else in the whole place would open. Anyway, as we go down, we settle down. My husband's davening. I'll have my tehillim. I'm wearing my tichel, my kerchief. Then a door opens. And the doors in this motel, so I'll just give you a little example. The doors in this motel, they don't open like, they open like this. Like, hasn't been like oiled in years. And I look up and there's this guy walks out, and I'm not exaggerating, a big man wearing just a bathing suit with his case of beer and a carton of cigarettes. And I'm hoping he just gets onto a truck and drives off somewhere. No, he comes down and sits down right next to my husband and I, who are trying to have like 45 minutes of quiet and sunshine before we get back home. Sits down, he starts drinking and smoking and drinking and smoking and steering. Now, did you ever try to relax when you have this spectacle? Clearly not. So the peace wasn't there, but what happened afterwards was really fascinating. He stands up, must have finished a couple of the beers, and he comes straight over to my husband and he says, so what are you? My husband says, I'm a Jew. What's your name? My husband says, Avraham. What's your name? Oh, I'm Joe. My husband says, what do you do? He goes, oh, I'm a tree hugger. He says to my husband, and what do you do? My husband goes, well, I'm a rabbi. A rabbi? What's a rabbi? My husband goes, a rabbi is, takes care of the community, like a priest. Because he figured this guy would have no clue about a rabbi. A priest, Then he looks at me and he goes, so she must be the nun. So my husband and I start cracking up. My husband goes, well, yeah, there is none like her, but we don't have nuns in Judaism. In fact, in Judaism, we don't have anything similar to priests and nuns. We rabbis get married, and we get very married. Like we have like lots of children married. So the guy's thinking, anyway, he eventually went off, but this really got my wheels turning. In Judaism, yes, we do allow for divorce, but how do we view marriage is the first question we have to answer. If marriage is something that is just frowned upon, like in Catholic society where it's holy and virtuous to be celibate, well, then marriage is just one of those things. If you can't hold back your urge, you get married. But in Judaism, what do we call marriage? We call it kiddushin. The ceremony of the wedding is kiddushin. What's the root of kiddushin? Kodesh. Think about what revolves around our tradition that have that same root. The Kodesh Kodashim is the Holy of Holies. Making kiddush on Shabbat. Someone who's saying a special prayer for the parent who passed away is saying Kaddish. There's a prayer in our Musaf that we stand and we called Kedusha. So we have Kiddush, Kiddushin, Kaddish, everything we've out. And what is marriage? It lumps itself with all the holiest mitzvot in Judaism. When you look at marriage in that way, then what I had said 2 weeks ago, how when we look at any challenges in relationship, in a marriage specifically, we put in all the effort we can. Why? Because this is important to me. And similarly to what I spoke about when Zalmi was born, and we knew that Zalmi was going to be a huge blessing, but also a tremendous expense. Why? Because we were going to have to put in thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on therapy. So with speech and OT and physio and cognitive and every kind of behavior management you could imagine, we endeavored. Why? Because Zalmi was our child and he was going to be with us forever. And we were going to make it the best it could be. There are times, I want to tell you, that there are parents that have special needs children and they do give them away. When things are so impossible, there are homes for special children because not always is it practical or even humanly possible, but we still try our best. Similarly, in a marriage, when there are challenges, we go for help. We go to a mentor, we go to a coach, we go to a therapist, we go to all extremes to get the help we need. Sometimes, if a relationship is toxic, where there could be emotional, verbal, sexual, physical abuse, Hashem says, you can't stay in this relationship. You have to go. And you have to go and do it the Jewish way. You go to a court that has a beth din with a gerus, and they sign up a contract. And yes, we're told that the altar sheds a tear. The Mizbeach cries. Because in Judaism, it's the soulmates that is now becoming disengaged, disattached. It's a cause for mourning. But sometimes, after so many trials of making it work, if it doesn't, Hashem says, yes, there is an avenue of divorce. But it's not until we put in every bit of effort to see if we can make it work.
Thank you for sharing that, Goldie. And it's actually a good segue to our next set of questions. We actually had 3 questions, all on the similar topic, and they all relate to dealing with conflict within a marriage and practical steps. But we had 3 questions that related to situations where husband and wife have differing views with regard to a mikveh. So one question related to the wife wanting to do mikveh, but the husband is not ready. And in such a situation, it causes conflict, even to just mention it. And questions around, am I not Jewish enough if I don't do mikveh? And another question around, there was a hesitation on this particular person to participate in mikveh because she felt she's just far too much of a private person. So maybe you can give us some insights into practical ways of dealing with conflict within the specific sphere of mikveh.
Okay, so one of the most important things to remember in Judaism, that we are not part of a tradition where it's everything or nothing. So my first suggestion, and this has come up to me many times, it's a common question. The first thing is to be able to work on the relationship. You have to come to a place in the relationship, like Serenne had said so beautifully, is you have to be vulnerable, but you have to create what I call the PSO, the positive sentiment override. You have to be in a home where there's a lot of talk and positivity and vulnerability, but a lot of positivity. And so the relationship is very strong, and the husband and wife have built a home that is built on a lot of communication, love, respect, a way of becoming a one, right? Become the basaracha that we so all aspire to have. When you're in a good, safe, happy space, then which spouse doesn't want to do for each other? So you can't bring up mikvah as part of, well, you know, I want to do this mikvah and it's something that's important for me. And why are you being so hard about it? And why are you negating my mikvah? Can't be presented that way to a spouse. It has to be something that is a wife's desire, but because the husband and wife have such a good relationship, then they each want to please each other. One of the things that I speak to a lot of the couples about is when a couple comes and says they're having their challenges in different parts of religion, I'll always go back to the basis of their marriage. And one of the things I really love talking about, and I'm sure you've heard of this book called The 5 Love Languages by Dr. Gary, I might have even mentioned it last week, is that each one of us, when we get into a relationship, we start off and we're very full and very complete and very content. But as the marriage goes on, we have to keep filling our tank. We call it the love tank. And I think that when one of the spouse's tanks is on empty, it's impossible to drive. And it's impossible to have a positive relationship and to be able to give if you are yourself are on empty. So it's about filling up your love tanks, filling up your emotional tank, giving each other what you need. And then when your goals are all about, I want to give you because I love you. Like a typical example, right? My husband always says, he buys me flowers every Shabbos, but he has no clue what's the deal with women and flowers. They sit in the vase, 5 days later, they're done, and roses are expensive. And what does my wife care about roses? But because he knows I love flowers and it does something to my Shabbos table, for 36 years, he's been buying me flowers. Rationally makes no sense to him. And for 36 years, he still didn't grasp it. But it doesn't bother him because this is what makes my wife happy. So when a couple love and respect each other and they built up their relationship that's strong and solid and connected, and they share with each other all the time, then when they're sitting together in an evening or they're going out on a date, and then the wife says, you know what would make me so happy? And it's not flowers, and it's not a $10,000 ring. It's if we can do the mitzvah of mikvah. So that's coming from a place of love and respect. And then maybe the husband would be more susceptible and more interested in being drawn into his wife's love. But the second thing that's very important is there was a woman in my community actually her husband wrote into the Rebbe. He was becoming frum, he was becoming more observant, and she wasn't growing. And he actually wrote to the Rebbe and he said, you know, I feel very, very uncomfortable being in this relationship because I am growing in my mitzvot. But for example, the mitzvah of mikvah is my wife's responsibility and she won't hear of it. Does the Rebbe think I should get divorced? It's right there. The question you asked me was already given. And the Rebbe answered very, very, very seriously. The Rebbe said, find a mentor for her. Find someone that she respects as a friend that could speak to her and encourage her in that growth. Because a husband shouldn't be the rabbi, and neither should the wife be her husband's rabbi. She shouldn't be teaching him about Torah, about Judaism. She could live by example, but she shouldn't be telling him what he has to do. He needs his own mentor. And that's what the Rebbe was saying. You keep doing the mitzvahs you're doing. Let someone else, a Rebbitzin in the community, a friend of hers, let her share the beauty of Judaism and mitzvot with her, so it will come from an outside. So that's number 2. But number 3 is that there are 613 mitzvot. And so I always tell the women who are struggling with this and their husband's not on board yet, there are so many other mitzvahs you can start with. Do the mitzvahs that you can. Work on your Shabbos candles, work on baking challah, work on tzedakah, work on kashrut, work on your prayers. Do things that are not in his face, because this question could be coming from a place, Sarah, maybe she wants to grow in her Judaism and he's not ready. And this could be a very, very strong friction in a relationship. So she should work on mitzvot that are not really creating too much havoc in the relationship.
Thank you, Goldie.
Did I answer it all? Did I leave anything out? Because there was a...
I think you did, but on that note, I just wanted to mention a housekeeping issue. If anybody has any questions for either Goldie or Serenne, and sorry I didn't say this earlier, we should have a little bit of time at the end of the session to hopefully get to them. So if you want to pop them into the chat section, and we'll hopefully get to them towards the end of the session this evening. Goldie, we're not done with you. We need to ask you one other question that we've had from one of the participants. And I know you touched on this 2 weeks ago, but I do think it's worth mentioning again, because I think for so many of, I would imagine nearly every wife and mother, this is a real issue when it comes to your relationship. And this woman says, I'm an exhausted mom. There's just no energy for me and my husband. And can you offer some insight and wisdom, Goldie, as to how we go about even beginning to tackle that, when I think, especially given the circumstances now, we are all, as you said earlier, our tanks are depleted totally and utterly. How do we make time for our relationships?
Okay. So I absolutely believe that every woman has to make time for self-care. And she has to make her marriage her priorities. I'll give you an example. I had a woman, and let's say I'll call her Rebecca. She had just started growing in her Judaism with her husband, and she started keeping Mikvah. And she calls me one night and she says, Goldie, I'm supposed to go to Mikvah tonight, but I have a headache and I'm totally exhausted and had a hard week with the kids and I don't feel good. Do I have to go to Mikvah tonight? So I said to her, Rebecca, let's say your friend just arrived from South Africa. You hadn't seen her in 14 years. And she just sent you the message that she is in the airport in Toronto. She has 6 hours before her next flight, let's say to Atlanta. And she asks you if you could meet her at the airport or if you can meet outside for a coffee outside the airport. I said to her, Rebecca, what would you say? Be honest with me. What would you say? And she started to giggle. And she goes, you know, if my friend who I haven't seen for 14 years asked me to come and meet with her for coffee, I would find the strength. So I said to her, I think what the problem is that we have put our relationship almost on the back burner. Our children come first, our jobs come first, even sometimes our parents come first. And our husbands, they'll be here. You know, we're married, it's okay. But I believe when the Torah tells us, Yazov ish es aviv imo, that a man has to leave his father and mother and connect and attach himself. And the word that's used is davek, to attach yourself to your spouse. Why is that a necessary commandment? And I think it's because Hashem is telling us, how do we prioritize ourselves? What is your priority in your life? If your priority is everything else, then you are going to be exhausted at night. But if your priority is your marriage, and there are many, many marital therapists, and Serenne could probably allude to this as well, that will tell you that the problems that are taking place in the home, whether it's in the dining room or the kitchen or just in the relationship, usually stems from the bedroom. When there isn't that intimacy, because intimacy, according to Jewish law, as we spoke about so much last week, is zivug. It's that connection of mind, body, and soul. It's not just a sexual act. It's about connecting. And when a couple just sees this as something, a physical act I have to do, it's my responsibility, it's just something that I have to give to my husband, then it becomes an act. And like all other chores, when you're tired, that's the first thing to go. But if we look at zivug as a moment of connection, the purpose of our whole uniting, we said that when we're standing under the chuppah, it's a reunification. The whole purpose that God created the world was so that these souls that have been created up in heaven and came down to the world should be reunited. Imagine if if we can look at it as this powerful, magnetic, important purpose of existence, then you don't look at it as just something I have to do. And so if I have a headache, so be it. If I'm tired, I say, my humble opinion is, you have to make time for yourself so that you and your husband can be together. When you are together in intimacy, in zivug, it actually, the effects, scientifically, they tell you, it actually has a positive effect for 16 hours afterwards, which means the next day is a positive day. Your husband goes to work happy. You wake up with an upbeat mood. You're giving the children breakfast and giving them their lunches in a happy space. Why? Because not only have you uncovered some endorphins, but you've actually spiritually brought something, which I alluded to last time, the Shechina, Sheroya B'nayim, that you have brought this godly blessing into the home. So for those of us who are very practical, yes, you bring out some more and endorphins and more positivity into relationship. That's for the very physical. But spiritually, you are bringing in Kedusha, you're bringing in Shalom Bayit, you're bringing in joy, Simcha, Ava, Achva, all these beautiful words that have been said at your chuppah. You know, all of us stood under the chuppah where the rabbi said the word Gila, Rina, Ditza, V'chedva, Ava, Achva, Shalom Reyes. Oh my goodness, so many descriptions to describe one marriage. Yes, because marriage is multifaceted. And marriage has so many emotions and there are so many adjectives. And when we aspire to be connected, it's not like we're doing anyone a favor. We are actually reinvigorating ourselves. So take time for self-care. Take an hour's nap if you have to every once in a while. Let your husband know during the day, I want to be available. I want to be with you. Can you watch the children for 45 minutes for an hour? Which husband will say no? So give yourself the time you need, take care of yourself, and make sure that you know that the priority is not with the friend that's arriving at the airport in Toronto, but your friend who is the most important person in your life, who you made this vow under the chuppah and you made a promise to be there for each other. That relationship deserves more of our attention than anything else.
Thank you, Goldie. I think that was really, really very powerful and valuable. And I think so many of us fall into the traps of putting our partners and our intimate relationships on the back burner because life gets in the way. But it's always so valuable to have the reminder that actually it really is the most important relationship for all of us. And I really liked what you said about that ripple-on effect that intimacy and that connection can cause, that once you make time for yourself and then for each other, that it unlocks all of those positive feelings, all of that blessing, all of that kedushin. That was really, really beautiful. Thank you. So I've got two questions which actually deal with a similar issue, and I'd like to address them to Serenne. And they actually both deal, Serenne, with conflict and perhaps differing views within a relationship. And the first question, I'm going to ask them together because I think you probably would address them together. So the first question is around a productive way for a husband and wife to fight. How do you fight in a respectful way but still addressing hurt which our spouse may make us feel? And then the other question was a similar topic, but it was a little bit more specific, but I think you'd probably answer them generally. So this person said, my husband thinks that school marks are a huge deal. He puts so much pressure on my kids to achieve a certain grade. I feel that life is not about marks, causes huge arguments and tensions. So I think both of those questions are really around dealing with conflict and perhaps some practical tools that you might be able to offer, Serenne, on how we deal with this in a way that's still respectful to one another.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that you're right, Sarah. Both the questions are talking about conflict in general, and I'll try and give you the headlines around my thoughts and feelings around managing conflict productively and in healthy ways. So the one question I'm thinking about is, fighting, and the second one around hitting heads around the importance of marks, you said, and the real arguments and tensions that it brings to the couple's relational space. But the actual details of the conflict don't really matter. You can kind of copy and paste any content you like and fill in the blank, as it were. So the couples I work with and see clash over a whole bunch of different issues, from parenting to in-laws, to finances, to who's doing what chores in the house, to sex. And I'm going to try and answer the questions by talking about conflict in general, and maybe looking at some of the do's and don'ts. So let's dive right in. So conflict, as I'm thinking about it, shows up in 3 different ways in the couples that I see. So group number 1 is no conflict. Group number 2 is low conflict. And group number 3 is high conflict. So let's see how this looks. Now, it's important to know that conflict per se in a relationship is not the enemy. In fact, the biggest predictor of divorce is not conflict, but the avoidance of conflict. You see, conflict is very often a call for connection. And when I meet a couple who say that they have no conflict, that's group 1, I really start to worry. So successful couples are not conflict free, but they're the couples who know how to resolve their disagreements and talk about their differences productively instead of staying stuck and polarized. That's group 2, who are low in conflict. So in the questions that have come through tonight, these couples can't seem to move on from the very different value that on the one couple that they attach to marks, and the other couple, battling to find adaptive ways to metabolize their disagreements. So it's important to know that in marriage, there is never landing just one true reality, but rather it's 2 people negotiating different subjective realities. There's my story, there's your story, and then the challenge really comes in crossing the bridge and making this our story. So conflict is inevitable, but here's the thing: combat is optional. Disagreements are inevitable, but like you said, disrespect is optional. So you can either choose to focus on what's tearing you apart, and couples are very good at this, or choose to focus on what is the glue that's keeping you together. So I often say to couples, ask yourself, what difference will what you're fighting about today make a month from now, a year from now, or 10 years from now? So I want to talk to you about John and Julie Gottman, who are 2 therapists who studied thousands of couples, and they outlined what they call the 4 horses of the apocalypse, which describe unhealthy behaviors in conflict. And I've spoken about this a lot in different forums, but it's really hard to have a discussion about conflict from my perspective without making some reference to these. So I want to quickly fly through them, because I think if we get a handle on this, it'll put you on the right track in dealing adaptively with disagreements and with conflict. So the first horseman is criticism, where we find fault, we judge, we attack, we use rhetoric like you always or you never. And let me tell you, criticism messes with the goodwill in our relationship in a big way, and it ramps up conflict in seconds. The second horseman is defensiveness, the not me syndrome, refusing to own your part in the story and not being accountable or taking responsibility. The third horseman is stonewalling. You might recognize this. It's giving the silent treatment, shutting down. Both of these are absolute relationship killers. Sulking, avoiding, disconnecting, distancing, walking away, refusing to engage. You get the idea. So one fed up husband I spoke to this week, he said to me, you know, love me or hate me, but please don't ignore me. The fourth horseman is called contempt. Now, this is the most deadly of the conflict artillery and the worst thing for a couple's prognosis. And it takes the form of belittling, putting down, character assassinations, name calling, diminishing, hostile humor, sarcasm, exposing or humiliating the other. And so these are the behaviors, everybody, these horsemen to avoid when you're trying to deal with conflict in your relationship. And of course, it describes that third group that I mentioned, the high conflict couples. So let's talk about some practical tools that can help you to manage conflict better. It alludes to the first question, I think, around fighting, and it's what we relationship therapists call fighting fair. Also a very well-known technique in working with couples. So number one, listen so that your spouse will talk, and talk so that your partner will listen. You know, the saying goes, if your mouth is open, you are not listening. The second one, you can't be mad about not getting what you didn't ask for. So no mind reading or guesswork. Number three, know when to bend and compromise. A good definition of compromise that I really like is when both parties walk away equally unhappy. Number four, be responsive, not reactive. Even the best couples irritate each other. And, you know, we are finding ourselves in lockdown where there's this intensive togetherness, where we have cabin fever, where we feel like we're living in a pressure cooker. It takes just 6 seconds to count to 10. So put some precious seconds between a strong feeling and a reaction that you might regret. Words are bullets, and you can't take them back. So number 5, now for a big one, and this is an absolute relationship saver. I think if couples were better at doing just this one thing, I'd be basically out of a job. And that is knowing when to say sorry. A happy marriage is a union of 2 forgivers. Number 6, in a relationship, you can be right or you can be happy, but you cannot be both. Right in a relationship has absolutely no value whatsoever. So you have to give up correct in order to connect. Number 7, no muckraking, which basically means exhaustively dredging up events from the past. Just keep to the present. Number 8, and this is the last one, no kitchen sinking, which basically means dealing with one issue at a time. No long laundry lists, cataloging all your complaints and dumping them all in the relationship sink at once. So everybody, the bottom line with conflict is that it can make you better or it can make you bitter. And that's the choice. So back over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Serenne. I really liked all those practical tips, and I'm sure that everyone on this webinar can resonate with many of those. I like the kitchen sinking at the end. I can't say I'm not guilty of that at sometimes, and I think most of us are. Serenne, while you're still here, I wanted to actually address this question to you. You mentioned stonewalling as one of the ways of dealing with conflict, and this particular question asks, how do you encourage a husband who does not want an emotional relationship and encourage him to understand that you do have emotions? I think it's the typical men are from Mars, women are from Venus. They just don't understand the way we process our emotions. How do you bypass that?
You know, I think that talking in broad brushstrokes, men we tend to categorize as being thinkers and women as feelers. And that makes for the interesting dynamic between men and women. We aren't a copy and paste of each other. There is for sure a gender differential. But something I see so much in the work that I do is what I call a connection discrepancy, where you have one partner who is hardwired in a more substantial way to want to connect, to want to get more emotionally intimate. And the husband is just not wired the same way, or his keenness on engagement and on connecting is just different. So the first thing I say to people is you have to just embrace the difference. And a very big take home that I give couples is you've got to take a trip into each other's world. Imagine what it might be for your wife, I say to him, when she keeps doing what we call bidding or reaching out, which bidding is the vitamin of love, where it's any kind of behavior that says to somebody, I want connection, I want closeness with you. When you keep closing that door, it puts the relationship in deficit. So it's a steep learning curve. And I very often work individually. I often do individual work when I'm doing couples work. And I help the husband to step up more and understanding that disenfranchising himself from this emotional space is not doing the relationship any good. So there are no quick fixes to it. There's no instant coffee solution to it, but it's absolutely workable. And I see this dynamic all the time.
Thanks, Serenne. So perhaps this couple needs to come and visit you. I've got another question, and I'd like to address this to you, Goldie. This question touched on your comment earlier about Hashem only gives you what you can handle. And I guess this question doesn't relate specifically to relationships, but this person was asking, how can you use this thinking to explain really terrible things that happen, the Holocaust, the genocide? How can you say that Hashem gives you things that you can handle when these really, really awful things are happening? How do those people handle those types of things?
Excellent question. And it's not a question that every Jew has never, ever thought of before. Being a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor myself, my grandfather lost 9 of his siblings when he was a young teenager and was left just with his brother. And him and his brother survived by living in sewers and eventually making it through to Shanghai. Him and his brother came out of the Holocaust with 2 very, very interesting and opposing views. My grandfather came out and focused on the miracle that I survived. And every minute of my life, Hashem was with me. When I was in the sewer and there was a Nazi crossing and he didn't see me. And when I made it through this border and I was able to sneak through, he noticed only Hashem's hand in his escape. Many survivors don't see it that way. However, there's one thing, Sarah, you and I and everyone must know. We can never, ever judge a Holocaust survivor, and we can never condone what the Nazis did. In fact, condoning or forgiving a Nazi is halachically not okay. You can only forgive someone that hurt you. I can't forgive the Nazis for what they did to my great aunts and uncles. Let them go to my great aunts and uncles who are buried in Poland or are not, and let them get forgiveness from them. But getting back to the question, how are we supposed to have this philosophy of trachting good or Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Bo between years, that Hashem only gives you what you can handle? So I read a very interesting answer, which works for me. When we see a friend who is challenged or is suffering, a loss of a child or suffering an illness, you cannot tell them, well, God gives you only what you can handle. Really? Since when are you God? You can say that to yourself when you're struggling. So when I'm in this situation where I was challenged, I kept using the phrase that Hashem is giving me the help and the courage I need to handle with my challenge. But I can never look at someone else who just gave birth to a special needs child and say to them, well, clearly you're a strong enough person, you can handle it. That's not the way the Torah wants us to lead our life. The Torah says you have to look at your predicament and encourage yourself and get the help you need. If someone comes to you and says, Goldie, I'm about to give birth to a special child, what can you tell me? I would never say to them, well, what are you complaining about? You can do it. What I will say is, let's look at the positive. Let's try to reframe. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite violinists was Yitzchak Perlman. Did I mention this story last time? Fagi, did I talk about Yitzchak Perlman last time? No. So I love classical music and I love the violin. So Yitzchak Perlman, as you know, is one of the most talented violinists ever, an Israeli Jew, probably now in his 70s. A friend of mine had treated me to a concert when he came to Toronto. Now, one of the things that many people don't know about Yitzchak Perlman, besides being one of the world's greatest violinists, besides being a Jew, an Israeli Jew, he suffered from polio as a child. And as a result, he wears braces on his legs. And so when he walks onto the stage at a beautiful concert hall, he walks very slowly, very purposefully, and then he sits down, undoes his braces, and then he takes out his violin. Well, one evening in Avery Fishery Hall, a huge hall in Manhattan, to the delight of thousands and thousands of men and women, Yitzchak Perlman was the star. And so he slowly walks onto the stage. Everybody's waiting for him to finally sit down. So he shouldn't trip or anything, shouldn't happen to him. And he finally sits down. And after he takes off his brace, he takes out his $100,000 violin and he picks it up. And as he begins to play with his first note, there's a huge burst and a loud crack was able to be heard. And everyone in the hall goes, oh, like in unison, oh, because what happened was one of the strings in his violin broke, which means that clearly he can't play on a violin because you can't play a beautiful concert on 3 strings. So everyone now was waiting for him to stand up, put back on his brace, go find another violin. No one knew what to expect, but that's not what happened that night in Avery Fisher Hall. With huge passion, with power, with purity, Yitzchak Perlman changed and recomposed the entire concert. He did the near impossible. He played an entire concerto on 3 strings. When he finished this concert, the entire hall erupted in a standing ovation and a thunderous applause. After everyone cheered and applauded and gave him a standing ovation, he asked everyone to sit down. And he said this sentence that resonates with me, and I share it with audiences ever. He says like this: sometimes the artist's task is to find out how much music we can make with what we have left. In life, God willing, we never go through the Holocaust. But there are Holocaust survivors, as I have seen embodied in my grandfather, who came out and played music on 1 string. He lost his parents and 9 siblings in 1 day in Warsaw. In fact, last year, our Shul took a trip and I begged them, please take me to that platform at the train station where my grandfather's family were shot in 1 day. But my Zayda was able to look at the violin and find that 1 string that made the music. Today, my grandfather, Oliver Shalom, who passed away a few years ago, has over 500 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren from 1 young teenage Holocaust survivor. We will never, ever, Sarah, and to the person who asked this question, we can never, ever give a reason for the Holocaust. I remember clearly like yesterday, when the question came up, it was actually given to the Rebbe before a Shabbos Farbrengen, where someone in Israel, a great leader, had given a reason why the Holocaust happened to the Jews in Europe. This person had the audacity the chutzpah to give a reason why the Holocaust happened, playing God. The Rebbe addressed this at the Farbrengen, and he cried. And he says, these are Kedoshim. Remember the word I alluded to before? These are the holiest 6 million Kedoshim. That is how they are referred to. They died al Kiddush Hashem just because they were Jewish. So we don't know why their souls had to leave early, and why 6 million had to leave this earth, and why their survivors, so many of them and their children, are still struggling with the terror and the fear and the nightmares. We don't know. And we can't, as human beings, even have the audacity to give reasons why the Holocaust happened. What we could say is that we could learn from some Holocaust survivors, and so many, who have built up their lives again and have built up empires of families, children, businesses. Some of the great in Toronto, most of the schools today, the Jewish schools, synagogues, were built with gifts from the Holocaust survivors. They have taken the tragedy and they have reframed. They have looked at their lives and they have mustered up the strength to rebuild and come out on top. And they are today the people that we look up to. So yes, I could never, ever say that I understand why the Holocaust happened and that they should have the strength. I can look at my challenge and only at my challenge and say, I'm learning from the best and the brightest and the survivors. I'm learning from my Torah. I'm learning from my guides who are giving me strength to look at negativity and say, if my Zayda could have witnessed his brothers and sisters being decimated, I can handle the challenge that I have. And I think, most of us today don't even come close to the challenges that they had. And so that gives us strength to say that we can get up again and rebuild and go on and still be positive.
Thank you, Goldie. That was really beautiful. And I can understand now where you get your extraordinary strength from. It must have been from your grandfather.
Absolutely, Sarah.
So it's 9 o'clock and I think we don't have any more questions. So I just want to thank you, Goldie, for once again inspiring us. Hope this isn't the last time we hear from you. I didn't actually mention, which I should have at the beginning, that Goldie's no stranger to the South African Jewish community. So many of the people in her community in Toronto are South Africans. So hopefully we will be hearing from you again. Serenne, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your practical tips. I think they really resonated with so many of us. And thank you to Itty, Goldie, and Fagi for once again organizing this. And thank you again to all of you for making the time to sign in. Have a good evening and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.